Hi again. My name is Madeline. I'm the Senior Education Coordinator here at Forest Canada. And thank you so much for joining us today to kick off Invasive Species Awareness Week. Today I'm going to be leading us in a webinar talking all about invasive species in our forests. So you might be wondering, what's this organization that you're with? So as mentioned, I work for Forest Canada. Forest Canada is a nonprofit organization dedicated to improving forest health and fostering a connection to nature in communities across the country. Our ambitious tree planting initiatives, extensive education programs, and decades of community outreach have resulted in millions of trees being planted annually. Our programs are developed and delivered under three broad pillars. So we do a lot of tree planting and forest stewardship, we do forest education, and we do community engagement. So together, we conserve, restore, and grow Canada's forests to sustain life and communities. This presentation was also developed with support from the Invasive Species Centre, or the ISC. Today, we also have one of our panelists is from the Invasive Species Centre. I'll introduce him later on, but we will have an expert here to answer some of your pressing invasive species questions at the end of the presentation. So the Invasive Species Centre prevents the introduction and spread of high-risk invasive species in Canada by connecting stakeholders with knowledge and technology. The ISC is a hub for collaboration and knowledge sharing. Their head office is located in Northern Ontario on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabeg, the Bechuana, and Garden River First Nations, as well as a longtime settlement of the Métis people in the Robertson-Huron Treaty area. So today, going through our agenda, we're going to look at what an invasive species is, how invasive species spread and impact our forests, some examples of forest invasives found in Ontario and beyond in most cases, and then we're going to get to some of your pressing questions. So first question for the room, what do you think an invasive species is? Maybe it's, a word that comes to mind when you think of invasive species. Maybe there's a specific example of an invasive species that you think of. You have another 20 seconds to think of maybe an answer. So what is an invasive species to you? Is it a specific species? Is it a definition? I'll take any and all answers you have for me. All right, I still have some participants typing. So let's look at what we already have written down. So we have an invasive species is a non-native, disruptive to local ecosystem. Species doesn't belong, Japanese knotweed, any species not from that place originally, organisms that are transported, species that destroys trees. You know what? We have a bunch of really good answers in here. Thumbs up to all of you. Ooh, dog strangling vine. That's a good call out. So absolutely, great answers to everyone. So yes, invasive species are species that don't belong in an area that can cause a lot of damage. Invasive species come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. They can be plants, animals, which includes insects, or pathogens. If you haven't heard the word pathogen before, those are microorganisms, which means they are very small organisms you cannot see with your eye that cause a lot of harm to whatever is hosting them. But that's pretty general. So what exactly will make these species invasive? Because we have these everywhere, right? We have plants, we have animals, we've got fungi, bacteria, just living absolutely everywhere. In order to be invasive, this organism has to be outside of its known and established range and cause harm to the environment, economy, or society. Invasive species cause harm for a few reasons. So, markers of a good invader, not maybe good for, the environment they find themselves in, but good for them. So a good invasive species grows or reproduces quickly. They are able to adapt to a wide range of new environments rather quickly. And they have no and or they have no predators in their new environment, or native species have no defenses against these invasive species, which means that ultimately the invasives can outcompete the native species and they can sort of win in the battle for the most ground or environment that they're living in. So, sorry, I didn't change the slide. But yes, this is an overview. So on this slide here, we can see some photos of invasives. So we have two examples. At the top, we have we have buckthorn, European buckthorn. It is very much an invasive species, and it is some of the first green you'll see in the springtime. So those leaves will just start to photosynthesize and get all the energy from the sun before anything else in the forest, which makes them faster at growing than other plants in the area. And then below, that is an emerald ash borer. And emerald ash borers are a good invasive species. They are good at invading because nothing here in Canada will eat them. So they are causing major, major damage to ash trees. They have no predators here to stop them. So now that we know what an invasive species is, you might be wondering how they move around, how they spread from one area to another. I have some photos here, maybe some hints as to how invasives can move around. But how do we think invasive species spread? Humans, wind, I think that says feces, which is correct. Eggs, boats, by humans or in ships, boats and ships, airports, lots of boats, wind blowing, birds. Moving firewood, oh, that's a good call. Wind blow, eating food, ballast from a ship. Ooh, the ballast is a good call out. All right. I'm going to stop us here because this is a very active word cloud. But look at that. Those are all entirely valid ways for invasive species to move around. So absolutely, most frequently, invasive species are transported to new locations through human activity. This can include things like tourism, shipping and trade, recreational activity like boats, and moving firewood. But they can also move through natural means such as wind transport, especially for things like seeds from plants. They can go through water currents, or they can travel through wildlife, whether it's hitching a ride on top of their fur, or in the feathers of birds, or even being dropped in animal poop. Um, so now that we know, what invasive species are, their common traits, and how they move around, let's go to our first example of an invasive species. So this is Dutch elm disease. Dutch elm disease is caused by a pathogen. In this case, it is a fungus that travels on elm bark beetles. So photographed here, we have a picture of an elm bark beetle. And under that, we have a picture of the galleries that they sort of form under the bark of elm trees. This sort of spreads the fungus around. Fungus will travel as spores, so little, dusty specks, and that will cause damage in the elm trees. So Dutch elm disease is originally native to Asia, but it was first discovered in the Netherlands, hence the name Dutch elm disease. It was transported through infected lumber from Europe to Canada in the 1940s. And by the 1980s, most elms in eastern Canada had become infected. They cause dark reddish brown streaks on bark. They lead to leaves wilting and turning brown and yellow. Um, and so as mentioned, the beetles cause these sort of butterfly-looking galleries. They breed underneath that bark. And of course, the baby bark beetles will then take those spores, take that fungus, and they'll travel to other elm trees in the area. Those baby beetles will emerge from those sick elm trees, and they'll travel to a healthy elm tree and spread the spores again and make it or cause Dutch elm disease in a new tree. Um, so this this species is or elm trees are a much needed shade provider in urban areas. They used to be really dominant here in forests in Ontario, and they were a very common tree species, sort of found in eastern Canada, but now they've been affected by this invasive for about 40 or almost 50 years. Um, the Dutch elm disease now is found all the way across Canada, from, the Maritimes out to Manitoba. And recently it's been detected in British Columbia and Alberta as of 2024. So, as we saw from the previous example, invasive species can have really, really dramatic effects on native plants, but they can also impact the landscape as a whole. So, I mentioned that invasive species have to cause harm to that new environment they're moving into. So, there are three types of harm that invasive species can cause. Firstly, there is environmental harm, where an invasive species can damage ecosystems in the environment. There is economic harm, where invasive species have financial impacts on individuals or organizations. And this can be things like landowners needing to pay for the removal of dead trees, or its impacts on something like the forest industry. So, reducing the amount of yield or how much wood can be taken out of a forest. If the wood is damaged, it can't really be used for things like telephone poles or construction materials. And so that's an economic harm. And then finally, invasive species can cause social harm, or they can impact our ability to enjoy our natural environment. Um, so photographed in social harm, so on the far right corner of the screen in that bubble, that invasive species is called a giant hogweed. Giant hogweed is a plant that can grow, I want to say like 6 feet tall, if not taller. They're very, very large. Um, and if you cut into a giant hogweed, the sap from it, the liquid that comes out of that plant, can get on your skin, and then it will result in your skin getting a very bad sunburn. So you don't get burned from the chemical itself, but it does cause a burn from further sun exposure. That is a sense of social harm. If you see this plant in a park, do you think you want to play in that park? Do you want to risk getting that sap on you? No. So let's look at some of the harm that invasives cause. So I want all of us to look at this photo for a quick moment and think about what we notice about this photo. Here's a hint. This photo was taken in the summer of 2021. So the photo back there, what did you see? Thinking, that photo was July of 2021. So we have sky, cars, no leaves, dead trees, road. Yes. Ash borer damage, that's a suggestion. The trees are very dead, not many leaves. Defoliated trees, defoliation is a big word. So there's no leaves on the trees. All right, yeah. So we have dead trees. Um, they weren't dead, they were very much alive, but they were missing all of their leaves. Um, so losing leaves is really bad for trees, especially in the middle of their growing season, as summer is the peak time for them to photosynthesize and make food with those leaves. With no leaves, those trees are in really big trouble. So that's what a lot of forests in southern Ontario looked like back in 2021. That damage was caused by the spongy moth. So photographed on screen here, we have the spongy moth. This insect has also been known as the LDD moth in the past, but spongy moth is the current common name. They are silk moths that, as caterpillars, will defoliate or remove all of the leaves from trees. They are very hungry caterpillars. While they show a preference for eating oak trees, they will eat the leaves of just about any plant, including needles from coniferous trees. The easiest way to identify these bugs is as caterpillars, which is how they spend most of their lives. So you'll notice in the photo, they have like they have 6 sets of red dots and then 4 sets of blue dots. And these very, very sharp, spiky, almost hair-like extensions from their bodies. As moths, so photographed on a backpack there is the LDD or the spongy moth itself. They don't really eat anything as adults, and they only really live long enough to lay eggs for the next generation. But these moths just eat a lot of stuff. Oh, and because of those very spiky hairs, birds don't like eating them. These are not tasty caterpillars. So they kind of just do their own thing. All right, we're looking at a second photo here. So there's something different about this photo than the last one. I want all of us to look at it very quickly, take it in. What do we notice about that photo? Leaf, leaves, peas, pods. That's a good one. Don't see the ground. More leaves of the same, holes in the leaves. Green. DSV. Ah, there we are. There's lots of life, full of plants. It is absolutely a photo full of plants. Ah, all right. So looking back at this, there is absolutely a lot of green in here, and there are a lot of leaves in here. But there is still a problem. It is all the same green leaf. Most of this image is all the same invasive species. It is dog strangling vine. Someone posted DSV, and that is absolutely correct. So you can see that not only the dog strangling vine is covering the forest floor and preventing anything else on that bottom of the forest from getting sunlight, but it's climbing up the trees. It's sort of it's out competing those native species, and it's taking up all the sunlight, all the space, just for itself in this thick green mat. While this may look lush and green, it is not ideal. In a healthy ecosystem, we want a wide variety of plants and other organisms to be thriving. What we want is biodiversity. Biodiversity is one of those big words that we throw around a lot, but what does it really mean? What do you think biodiversity is? So what do you think of when you hear the word biodiversity? Life, nature, different life, absolutely. Variety of life in nature, many different species, life on Earth, animals living in nature. Yeah, we've got it. So biodiversity is absolutely the variety of life on Earth on all levels, from a variety of species in an ecosystem to a variety of individuals within even a single species. Plants, animals, and fungi are all parts of whole healthy ecosystems. There is always a balance with biodiversity, with each plant and animal having a role to play no matter how big or small. If an invasive species comes into an area or outcompetes or eventually replaces a native species, it can cause issues to the ecosystem and eventually lead to a loss in biodiversity. So speaking of a loss of biodiversity, here's one invasive species that can cause issues in forests, and it is garlic mustard. So as you can see in the big picture on here, garlic mustard can absolutely take over an area and prevent the growth of other plants or outcompete native plants. These plants are very good at forming a monoculture where all plants in an area are the exact same species. But they don't do this by growing fast. They do this by producing a chemical through their roots, which you can see their taproot in that bottom photo there. This chemical prevents other plants from growing around it. That way, they can use all the resources in the area and they don't have to worry about any neighbors. Um, these plants have a 2-year life cycle. So the top image is year number 1, where they have little basal rosettes. So they have leaves that sort of wrap around the stem and they sort of lay low on the forest floor. But then in their second year of growth, they start to get really, really tall with these triangular leaves and small white flowers. Their seeds will grow throughout June and eventually they will release in late June. And these plants can drop thousands of seeds at a time and create really, really dense populations of garlic mustard, like you see in the previous slide and on this one here. One thing I'll note as well is that garlic mustard, it's related to mustard plants, but it smells like garlic. So if you touch the leaves or if you crush the leaves a little bit, they will smell like garlic. That being said, one thing I want to let everyone know is please don't touch random plants outside without supervision, because there's many plants out in nature, things like poison ivy and such, that can cause rashes and other harm to your body. So please be mindful. Don't just touch any plant you see just to see if it smells like garlic. You might be getting other oils on your hands. So on this slide, we can see the range of garlic mustard in Ontario. All of these sightings have been grouped into convenient bunches. So instead of individual dots, they just kind of all smoosh together, and you can see how many sightings of garlic mustard is seen approximately in each of these areas of the province. So as you can see, there's a lot of garlic mustard in Southern Ontario. There's a few reasons for this. But the big ones are that there's a lot of trade and travel in Southern Ontario, especially thanks to the Great Lakes being right there. There's a very diverse geography wherein there's a lot of different landscapes found in Southern Ontario. So there's sort of a little corner for everything. But there's additionally very high human population. So garlic mustard seeds can get into people's shoes, people can walk around, take the seeds with them. And there's also many disturbed environments. And one of the downsides of a disturbed environment, so think like putting a shovel in the ground, digging up a hole. A good invasive species will take advantage of that disturbance and they will take over it because they don't have any other competition in there and they typically grow quite fast. Garlic mustard grows incredibly fast and loves disturbed environments. So while there's a lot of garlic mustard, there's also organizations and people working to remove it from the environment. So these photos show a garlic mustard pull where volunteers got together to pull up garlic mustard for the sake of the environment. And you might be wondering, why are there garbage bags? Surely these are plants. Plants need to go in the compost bin. Well, the plastic garbage bags, the black garbage bags there, are used for solarization. So the seeds and roots of many invasive species, including garlic mustard, are incredibly hardy and they can reproduce even if they're pulled out of the ground. So let's say you pull up the garlic mustard, you put it in the compost pile, it's probably going to keep growing. So putting it in a trash bag lets you effectively cook the plant, the seeds, everything in the sun. So you solarize it. And then after that, you can dispose of it as needed. and it very likely won't grow again. So invasive species can impact any area, but as mentioned, there are um, some areas that have more than others. In areas that are very urbanized, especially say somewhere like Southern Ontario, where there's a lot of development, there's a lot of cities, you will wind up with a lot of invasive species, but you'll also wind up with a lot of um, issues in those cities because of the invasives. Um, so you might be asking yourself, how do invasive species impact how people interact with nature? So first, they reduce biodiversity, which results in a loss of ecosystem services. So maybe there's less trees to filter the air or to, take up carbon dioxide and give us oxygen in our cities. They're also going to reduce the amount of canopy cover we have in urban areas. It's very expensive to replace mature trees. So if we have big old trees that are, full of invasive species or they're really diseased, that tree can't really be replaced with something that age. So if it gets cut down, there's no more shade from that tree. There's no more oxygen coming from that tree. You also get some invasives that are hazards to human health. So you get things such as falling branches from dead or dying trees. You get the giant hogweed I was talking about before that makes it a little bit unpleasant to go out into natural spaces. It could also be, the trail could be choked up with dog strangling vine, which does kind of suck to walk through. Um, and then that also leads to impacts on neighborhood recreation. So people don't want to visit local parks anymore due to, safety concerns or dead standing trees or this lack of shade. Um, Ultimately, um, we want to make sure that invasive species aren't spreading, right? People do transport them, they do come in, but it's really important to handle them quickly and efficiently by preventing their further spread before they really take root in communities. Um, if you invest in preventative action before the species arrives, um, you save a lot of trouble in the long term when you're managing for these invasive species. Once the species arrives, the population will grow, it'll expand, they'll get out of control really easily, and invasive species management becomes very expensive and complicated the longer a species is sort of left to its own devices. Um, So there are many ways to prevent the spread of invasive species before they get a chance to establish themselves. For one, we can provide education and increase awareness of these invasive species. Hopefully, after this presentation, you'll keep an eye out for invasives near you. This means that there's more eyes on the ground looking for invasive species and hopefully reporting them. If more people are looking for invasives, we can detect them early and deal with them rapidly before they become an issue in our communities. This can include species that might already be in Canada, but maybe they haven't made it to your region yet. By learning about what might be coming along the horizon, you're more likely to keep an eye out for them, and when you do see them, report as quickly as possible. I'm going to end this presentation with a final invasive species, but one that has a happier ending. So this is an Asian longhorn beetle. Asian longhorn beetles are shiny black beetles with irregular white spots on their body, bluish white legs, and long black and white antennae. These beetles look really similar to native species found in Canada, such as the white spotted sawyer. So I recommend leaving the removal of this one up to the experts. So as larvae or as like wiggly little baby beetles, they hatch from eggs and burrow under the bark of their host tree, feasting away on the insides. Um, when you they can be found in any sort of deciduous tree. Um, but they prefer things like maples and oaks. So yeah, maple, birch, elms, willows, sorry. Um, they spread via human transportation. So this is a species that can travel on firewood. They're really a persistent pest in Eastern North America. And they travel very easily by hiding away in firewood. Uh, that being said, this species has been successfully eradicated from Ontario 2 times, with the most recent eradication announced in 2020 after 5 years of no significant sightings. Quarantine zones, restriction on the movement of potential host trees, and strict monitoring and detection in areas like Toronto helped in this effort. So basically, there was a lot of limitations put on how firewood traveled. If any of you have driven in or through Toronto before, you may have seen these regulated area signs in and around the city, and that is to prevent the human-caused spread of these beetles. So yeah, they've successfully been eradicated twice, which is really, really cool. And with all this effort, it's hard to imagine what our forests would look like if it was allowed to spread through Ontario. It certainly would have impacted the supply of wood from Ontario and Canada as a whole, and it would have had a massive impact on maple syrup production if maple trees were left dying due to this invasive species. So you might be asking yourself specifically, well, what can I do? I'm not an expert. I don't know what these things look like on site. Um, if you're looking at trees, you can always monitor your local trees. And if you see anything different, you report them with the Invasive Species Center survey form, which ultimately helps create a better understanding of the current health of your community trees. So the Invasive Species Center has a tree check form that you can go through and report how your tree is doing. There's also an app called EDD Maps. So I showed some maps from EDD Maps before. That was where the garlic mustard map was. But it helps you report sightings of invasive species directly to a distribution database. Through community science efforts like EDD Maps, scientists and researchers have a really good sense of where problem areas are and where might need some more attention. Because realistically, Canada's a really big country. Every province is very large, and not everyone can be everywhere to observe every tree, right? So it takes sort of everyone to know a little bit about invasives to figure out what's going on. So in summary, invasive species are non-native species introduced to new areas where they will outcompete native species. Invasive species have a negative impact on the environment, economy, or society. And invasive species prevention is key to their management. And you can help prevent their spread. So if you find an invasive species while outside, report them using something like EDD maps. So thank you so much for joining us today. My presentation is complete. That being said, we do have a Q&A. So I'll be here answering questions. But here with me as well, I have David Dukevich, who is an entomology technician with the Invasive Species Center. Hi, David.
Hello.
All right. So as a heads up, I am not looking at the Zoom chat. If you have any questions for us, please feel free to put them through AHA Slides. We have some questions pending at the moment. All questions are moderated. So, okay, first question. My organization is trying to phase out plastics. Are there any alternatives to plastic garbage bags for solarizing garlic mustard? David, do you have an answer to that?
So the reason why we use plastic bags for this type of thing is garlic mustard, since it's an invasive species, it cannot be mulched, unfortunately. The best way to get rid of it is to do a deep burial if you're not going to be using those types of plastics. So deep burial, we're talking like burying it usually in dump landfills and things like that. And you're looking at 10 feet or deeper for those types of burials. Other than that, they do have to go into a plastic garbage bag and be disposed of. Like Maddie said, that they need to essentially be cooked in the bags before they can actually be disposed of.
Thank you. All right, we've got a second question here that I also do not have an answer for. So I'm going to post this one to you again, David. What steps are being taken regarding oak wilt disease?
So there's several steps being taken right now. Most of the steps that are being taken for oak wilt disease prevention is, like I said, prevention. So it was found in Canada in 2013 or 2023, which was 2 years ago. Immediate action was taken. So there was two locations in Niagara region, as well as one in the close to the Barrie area in Springwater Township. And those two locations were actually a team from the Canadian Forest Services, the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, as well as the Invasive Species Center and the Ministry of Natural Resources were all dispatched. And essentially what they did was these trees were cut and removed by a giant crane. They were giant trees. Like I wouldn't be able to fit my arms around them. They were such large trees. And these trees were removed. They were then transported to a landfill. And once they were at these landfills, these trees were buried using a backhoe. And like I said, the deep burial method to get rid of these massive trees. So that's what ended up happening. And that all happened within a month. So that's what we were talking about, these rapid responses, is once it was detected, the action that was put in place happened within a month. And then we do what it's called is site surveys afterwards in order to monitor the trees afterwards. So the trees were they were essentially any trees around it, any oak trees around it that may have been infected. Those trees are being monitored continuously to make sure that that disease does not show up again in those populations. So essentially, like I said before, prevention, we did a small eradication and we're still looking for prevention for oak wilt.
All right, thank you. I'm going to check that one off. So I'll take this question from Melissa. So, have you ever found an invasive species? I absolutely have. So the spongy moth photo on the road there, that was a photo I took as a passenger in that car, looking out and being like, "Oh no!" Looking at all those trees with absolutely no leaves. Um, it, there's a lot of invasive species. I live in like south, kind of central Ontario. So we have a lot of invasive species. So we have dog strangling vine, we have spongy moths, we have Phragmites, which isn't a forest invasive, but it's really big grass that you see on ditches on the sides of roads. Invasive species are everywhere. And once you learn what they are in your area, you'll also be able to go out on walks and look, and you'll see quite a lot. Okay, so top question here. How can we prevent invasive species at home? That's a good question,
Um,
David.
yeah, I think the best way to prevent invasive species at home is really to worry about what you're doing to actively prevent. So when you go out to the store with your parents and you're looking for plants to plant in your garden, you know, are there invasive species that you're bringing home with you? So things in garden centers can sometimes have invasive species. One of the things that the invasive species center is trying to do is to prevent the sale of invasive species in Ontario. Other things you can do is thinking about moving firewood. A big portion of why we have invasive species in a lot of the forests is because people moving firewood around the province. Um, so things that you should think about is, burning where you buy. So if you're going on a trip somewhere, or if your cottage is in Northern Ontario, but you live in Southern Ontario and you see this old tree is going to die, so I'm going to cut it up and I'm going to bring it to the cottage. Please don't do that. So a really good rule of thumb is to not move firewood out of a 100-kilometer radius of where you found it, because that will help prevent the spread of invasive species.
Yeah. Other things you can do as well is, if you're hiking on a trail, let's say, make sure to clean all the dirt out of your shoes before you get back in the car. Make sure there's no seeds or anything, maybe on your dog, if you're taking your dog out for a walk in the forest, or in your local neighborhood and are about to go into a forest. All sorts of little things like that. Um, there's a lot of ways to prevent invasive species.
Oh, take pictures.
Oh, and take pictures.
Take pictures
Absolutely.
of things.
Because yeah, you'll let other people know what's in the area. Oh, good question from Jamal. Why is it called garlic mustard? It's called garlic mustard because it smells like garlic. Uh, um, so if you walk through a field of garlic mustard, which please be mindful touching plants out in nature, but if you walk through a field of garlic mustard, your pants will smell like garlic, your shoes will smell like garlic. It is kind of funny. How long have invasive species been in Ontario? Um, a lot of our invasive species have been here for quite a while. So our earliest invasive species would have come over in the 1600s. So the French and the English would have brought seeds over from Europe, whether those were intentionally brought over as garden plants. As David mentioned, it's very easy to have invasive garden plants. Um, or it was just stuff that came over on boats. Um, but we've had all sorts of invasive species come over, and with just globalization in general, with how stuff is shipped around the world, there's always new species moving around, right? Um, so we've had invasive species for quite a while, and we will continue to do so. For the disease, is there a cure for it? Aria, I think that question would be about Dutch elm disease, because I think that's the only disease I talked about. I don't know if there's a cure for Dutch elm disease. It's a fungus.
So, Dutch elm disease doesn't have a cure, but it has what is it called? It has a fungicide that does work for it. So it prevents the tree from getting infected. So oak wilt doesn't have that same fungicide that will prevent it from getting infected. So oak wilt tends to be more susceptible. But in Dutch elm disease, which is a type of wilt disease, what you can do is why we see a lot of like really tall giant elm trees still around, usually around significant buildings, courthouses. Some people have large ones in their yard. It's because they actually actively treat their trees every 2 years with a fungicide, which essentially prevents the fungus from growing within the vascular tissue. So within the tissue of the tree that sends water and nutrients from the roots all the way up to the leaves.
Yeah. So it's kind of like giving the tree a flu vaccine, right?
Yes.
It's preventing the tree from getting the fungus.
Yeah.
So no cure, but there is prevention available. Um, what is the most invasive species from Massimo? Uh, a lot. I don't know. In my opinion, I always like to say emerald ash borer just because it's a nightmare. But
Well, emerald ash borer is a very recent one, but I
it,
also want to bring up too chestnut blight.
oh,
How
yeah.
many people know of an American chestnut tree, or have ever seen an American chestnut tree?
Yeah, we really don't have those. So,
So
yeah.
chestnut trees, American chestnut used to be a tree that was everywhere in southern Ontario, all the way up to Sault Ste. Marie. It was a tree that was very prevalent and heavily used in um, a lot of situations. Even there's songs written about it. You hear Christmas songs about roasting chestnuts over an open fire. Chestnut trees were a huge marketable tree in the 1800s and early 1900s. So, chestnut blight, which was a blight from Europe, which is a disease, it was brought over and it was released into the chestnut trees, and American chestnut was very susceptible to it. And now it's very, very, very difficult to track down a chestnut tree. And if you see a live chestnut tree, it's a very, very rare occurrence now.
Yeah. Um, you might have chestnut trees, maybe part like planted on the side of tree roads or whatever. It might be, it's probably a horse chestnut, right? American chestnut just fully isn't really an option.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. I forgot about chestnuts because they barely exist. There are like, I think there's like a American chestnut preservation thing going on, but those plants are very few and far between nowadays. Um, Here's one. Is there a way to get rid of an invasive species for good?
Well, I mean, you gave a really good example of how we were able to get rid of Asian longhorn beetle. So Asian longhorn beetle was detected in the early 2000s in area around Toronto. And we got rid of it because we were very proactive and we sort of pounced on it because we were seeing that the US was struggling because it once it got into the forests, you couldn't really engage with it anymore because it was just too hard to find when it's in the massive trees and massive forest area. I've been to Ohio where they've still been battling it, and they essentially have to hire tree climbers in order to climb every tree in a forested area in order to see if they can see the exit holes, see if they can see the oviposition pits. So once they find them, they have to basically cut down almost the entire forest in that area, which is pretty devastating to see. Um, so what ended up happening was in 2003, the Ministry of Natural Resources, the City of Toronto, the Canadian Forest Services, as well as the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, they basically all got together with the City of Toronto and they cut down every single tree within a certain radius, which ended up being something like 27,000 trees that they cut down in order to make sure that species didn't actually leave the area and get into forests. And so they've been actively monitoring that for over 25 years now. And in Canada, they still monitor for it. And it's one that we have actually been able to get rid of for good. But the United States has not had the same luck because they received it first. So they were trying to figure out what was going on with it, but we were able to take the research that they did and really activate a protocol in order to get rid of it from Canada.
Yeah. And then due to proximity, there's always the risk it's going to come back, right?
Yes. Yeah.
But for now, it's not here.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah, so we have one question here. It seems that there's many tree species being impacted by invasives. Any advice for tree species that would be good to plant in Northern Ontario?
Yeah.
Native ones?
Well, native ones definitely, but I think the better way of thinking about this is looking for greater diversity. So, um, cities around Ontario really got in trouble with this twice, actually. Um, they, in the, when was it? The early 1900s, elm trees were great to plant in cities because they didn't have a lot of pollen. They were easy to plant. They were really beautiful to make these giant canopies. So a lot of urban foresters planted elm trees all over the place. Well, then we had the introduction of Dutch elm disease, wipes out a lot of those trees. So the city planters are like, what's our next tree that we're going to plant? So then they plant in the 70s and 80s, they plant ash trees because they're very hardy species. They grow really well. You know, cities are a really harsh environment. So they were able to plant all these ash trees around and it worked out really well. Well, in the 2000s, emerald ash borer came on the scene, wiped out a lot of those trees. So now city planners all around when they're replacing the ash trees, they tend to look at how much diversity can I put into this area. So how many maples species, how many Kentucky coffee tree species. They're really opening their availability at different trees because if you plant these monocultures of trees in your cityscapes or in your properties and things like that, that's when you can have a species come in and wipe out everything. So being very diverse with your planting of trees is the best way to counteract invasive species.
Yeah, and it's sort of twofold, right? Because in one way, you don't have the same tree species super, super close together so that species can jump side by side. And you also want to make sure that if an invasive species does come in, you're only losing like one in every three trees or one in every six trees, right? So
Yes.
it's beneficial in that way. Yeah. So yeah, you're right. Diversity is a good one.
Yeah. And monitoring. Make sure
And
you
more.
keep an eye on your trees and how they're doing.
Yeah. So there's a question here. Why do we get invasive species, and does Canada have good nutrients to support their growth? So we get invasive species due to a lot of just global transport. Um, Anything that can be found in a temperate climate similar to Canada might be able to find a home here. So one thing I had mentioned is Ontario has really, really diverse geography, and that holds true for all of Canada. We have a lot of different ecosystems. We have different types of forests. We have different types of grasslands. Um, because of this wide variety of ecosystems, there's a little something for every invasive species, right? So maybe there's one invasive species that likes open fields. Maybe there's an invasive species that likes predominantly maple-based forests. We've got it all. Um, so it's not so much that we have good nutrients, it's that we have high elevation, low elevation. We have interesting climate features. And invasives also wind up being very generalist, which means they kind of like to grow everywhere, which is why you can find them everywhere.
Maddie,
Yeah. Oh,
just wanted
sorry.
to mention.
Yes.
Oh, yeah, no, just to jump in, I think something that might be worth mentioning too is it's not that only Canada gets invasive species. There are many species that are native to Canada that are invasive elsewhere.
Oh,
So we can export them as well as we can accept them or import them. So that's an important thing to note.
oh yeah, very much so. So because invasive species are species that are non-native to one area, taking over another place, the transfer goes in all directions. So there are species, like even within Canada, there are species that can be invasive because let's say they're from the Maritimes and for some reason they find themselves in British Columbia. Well, that could be invasive,
One
right?
example that comes to mind for me, because we had a question about that too, but on other continents that originate in North America, is raccoons are invasive in parts of Asia.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good one. Um, I'm
Pine tree nematode is another one.
Pine tree
It's
name,
a
really?
species from Canada that is invading Portuguese and Spanish pine forests.
That's unfortunate. It's all invasive species are always unfortunate. Um, but yeah, it there's just so much transfer of stuff again due to shipping, transportation, the dirt in your shoes. Um, it's things are moving places where they shouldn't. Okay, we have a few questions here. Oh, from Aaliyah in the chat, goldenrod is invasive in Australia. I can believe that. So our goldenrod that we see all through, September and even early October, it's invasive somewhere else. Uh, Here's a question. So from Michael, are invasive species always bad, or that can they fill ecological gaps and provide benefits?
So
So
I was going to say you can go first if you want to answer that one.
I was just going to
Answer
say
two.
it is possible to have non-native species that do provide ecological benefits. Not all non-native species are invasive. Due to the nature of an invasive species, though, they do cause harm. So that's my answer.
Yeah.
But
Well, I was just going to say, you're right on the money with your definition, and that's the big thing is you have to look at the definition of invasive species. It has to cause some kind of ecological harm, a monetary value of harm, or a sociological value of harm. So it has to hit one of those three in order to become invasive. So, there are lots of non-native species that do come to Canada that they don't become invasive because they don't reach one of those three variables that makes them bad. But you can also have introduced species that are introduced by scientists in order to counteract invasive species, such as what's known as like biocontrol agents. So emerald ash borer is a really good example of that because there was really no like very effective natural predators. There's woodpeckers and things like that, but they're not really impacting the population too much. Whereas in their native range, there's a type of
the
essentially a
wasp.
parasitoid which will go after these species and parasitize them at a 60% parasitism rate, which is a huge amount more. So to knock back 60% of the population is something good. So scientists were able to collect that species and rear it in the U.S. and Canada, and then release those species in order to track down emerald ash borer. Now, there's a lot of research that goes into those types of beneficial non-native species to make sure that they don't actually attack our native species. So parasitoids are a really good example of that because parasitoids will only really go after one specific species. Their life cycle depends on one specific species. So those research, goes into that to make sure that it doesn't impact native populations.
Yeah. So that's an example of a non-native species causing
Benefit.
ecological benefits here for the matter of invasive control. Yeah. All right. We still have a lot of questions, but we are at 2 o'clock. So I don't know. Do we keep answering questions? You're welcome to leave, audience. If you would like to leave, we are at our limit in terms of time. Um,
I can answer a couple more questions.
yeah, we
The,
can
the
answer a
one
couple more questions, but don't feel pressured to be here, is my point.
I
Anyways,
was,
David, thank you.
yeah, I was going to say there's one that I thought was interesting that I think is pinned on the screen. That I planted a chestnut tree of a
Oh, yeah.
Chinese and American cross. How can I protect them? That is the protection. So um, there are some tree species out there that are basically crossed between two genera, so they're cross-pollinated in order to create these hybrid trees, which tend to be effective in preventing diseases and things like that. So um, the protection is the cross between the Chinese and American chestnut. If that makes sense.
No, that makes total sense. Um, so we have a few questions here that are the same, where it's how many invasive species are there in Canada and how many invasive species are there in Ontario/Canada? Do you have a sense of how many invasive species we have?
Um, I think we're over 100 that are actively monitored for um, in both Canada and Ontario as well. Ontario has the most amount of invasive species, in the province compared to the other provinces. But in Canada, there are different invasive species that affect insects or diseases in insects and plants in BC versus eastern provinces. So there's definitely over 100.
Oh, we got that question a lot, actually. Um, with regards to disposing invasive species, what about burning? Burning invasive species away.
It's a technique.
It's a technique. It's an
Yes.
option.
Um, this isn't a invasive species in Ontario, but it is a native species that this technique is actually used on, which is mountain pine beetle. And the worry about mountain pine beetle is that it might become an invasive in Ontario, even though it's native to BC and Alberta. So what they do in the summertime is they actually what's called girdling trees, and they'll go out and kill the tree by cutting around the base so that it disrupts um, the nutrient flow through the tree. The insects will attack the tree and attack the trees near it. And then in the wintertime, they go out to those sites and they cut down all those trees and burn them. And that's an effective measure for killing a bunch of insects. I think they also burn Phragmites fields too.
Yeah, Phragmites is highly flammable. So I didn't talk
Yes.
about it at all in this presentation because I did want to like focus on forest invasives. So for context, I mentioned it before, Phragmites is like a really, really tall grass. They can get to like 2 meters tall. You'll see it on the side of road, growing out of ditches, growing on lake shores, things like that. Um, Burning is absolutely a control method. Um, it's a nightmare to remove. There's like 10 different ways to get rid of frag.
Yeah.
Um, oh, and then here's a recent question that I quite like from Adriana again. What is the latest example of a biocontrol being used in Ontario?
There's a couple. I know there's one actually for Phragmites that a colleague of mine is going to be studying as his postdoc. It's a type of caterpillar that grows in the stem and essentially girdles it from the inside. But emerald ash borer is a one that is comes to mind.
This is very
And
recent, right?
yes, so in 2012 is the first when they released it in Canada. There's three different types of parasitoids that were released, and these parasitoids essentially one attacks the egg of the emerald ash borer, the other one attacks the small larva of the emerald ash borer, and the third one attacks larger trees because it has a longer ovipositor, a longer essentially way to attack the emerald ash borer in the bark or underneath the bark. So these parasitoids, what they do is they fly around, they sense the emerald ash borer, they use their ovipositor, which is a very long tube that essentially drills through the tree, and they basically inject their eggs into the larva of the emerald ash borer. And then, if anyone has ever seen the movie Alien or ever seen Alien versus Predator, you have a sense of what actually happens. The parasitoid eats the host and then just bursts out and emerges, and that's their life cycle.
Which is really cool.
Insects are wild.
Insects are so cool. So I don't know about the dog strangling vine control in the DVP, the Don Valley Parkway. Do you know anything about that?
I think I haven't really heard too much about the specific project that's been going on. But I think there are control measures using pesticide or herbicides to get rid of those.
Yeah, because dog strangling vine is noticeable.
Yes.
It's a very obvious invasive. So then I feel like we've answered some of these questions before. This will be our last one, I think. So this is from Adrienne. So my organization is creating interactive programs and displays to educate visitors on how to prevent the spread of invasives. What are some great contacts or resources we can draw from? Any super successful awareness projects that come to mind? I would like to say one thing, and then I'll pass it over to you because I'm sure you have a better understanding of all the resources out there. There is a Grow Me Instead guide for planting. Um, I love it. It's the specifically the Ontario Invasive Plant Council, if I recall correctly. I don't think physical versions of it are really available anymore. It is exactly that. It is available as a free PDF online. The Grow Me Instead guide is really, really good because it shows you a picture of things that you should not be growing and then things you can replace it with that have similar nutritional requirements, sunlight requirements, or even just look similar for your garden. That booklet is always my go-to recommendation. It is one of my favorite things that has ever been made in Ontario. Um, so I'll pass
A
it over.
copyright key.
Yeah, you have a copy too. It's so good.
The Grow Me Instead guides are great. Um, Invasive Species Center website has a lot of really great resources for different types of guides and where to start. Another great resource, although you have to search a little bit more, like it requires more research, is the Canadian Food Inspection Agency website. Has a lot of regulatory information on that. You may be curious and wondering why I keep referencing the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, because you think about Canadian food inspection. They also do plant. They have a Plant Protection Act, which they basically are mandated by the government and by the law in order to deal with invasive species by preventing them from coming into Canada, as well as monitoring for them as well. So the Invasive Species Center, or not, sorry, the Canadian Food Inspection Agency is a really great resource in order to look up invasive species information for Canada.
Yeah, especially since we have things like spotted lanternflies, which are,
Yes.
they're a massive agricultural pest. So it does make sense, right? The connections are absolutely there. Um, all right. So that's it for questions. Thanks again to everyone for joining us. Hope you enjoyed the presentation. If you have any further questions, you are welcome to reach out to us, and we're happy to either find answers for you or redirect. You can reach us on the Forest Canada website. You can reach out to David as well, or the Invasive Species Center by going to the Invasive Species Center's website. And again, this week is Invasive Species Awareness Week. So please keep your eyes out. There's probably plenty of things happening this week, whether it's, infographics, activity books, other presentations, and so on. If you follow the Invasive Species Center on social media, I'm sure you will see the whole itinerary of things happening this week. So yeah, I think that about wraps it. Thanks again for coming out, folks. Hope you enjoyed our presentation today.